My name is Margaret, and I'm in my mid-50s. I've been working in the same company for nearly 2 decades, comfortably navigating the routines and the predictable pace. I thought I knew my coworker, Richard, well enough. He's always professional, polite, and steady, until that afternoon in the conference room changed everything. It started with an email from Richard asking me to stay late to discuss some project details. Normally, I would have sighed and rolled my eyes, expecting a tedious conversation about spreadsheets or deadlines. But something about his tone made me curious, almost like a quiet invitation rather than an obligation. When I arrived, the office was unusually still. The hum of the air conditioner, the faint flicker of the overhead lights, and the polished surface of the conference table all seemed amplified in the silence. Richard was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline with an unusual pensiveness. He didn't turn when I entered. I paused, unsure if he expected someone else, or no one at all. Then, without looking at me directly, he said something that made my heart skip. "I didn't realize how much I've been missing moments like this with you." It wasn't a flirtatious remark. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simply honest, and it landed in a way that felt both shocking and comforting. I felt my pulse quicken, not from anxiety, but from a sudden awareness that something had quietly been growing between us for some time. We sat down at the table, and the conversation began with the project, but quickly drifted. He asked about my weekend, my hobbies, little things that showed he genuinely cared. Not the polite coworker kind of interest, but a deeper curiosity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I could feel my shoulders relax. The energy in the room shifted subtly. There was an emotional closeness forming, gentle and unspoken. We laughed, shared stories, and discovered common threads in our experiences. The conference room, which had always felt cold and impersonal, transformed into a quiet sanctuary where honesty could breathe. Then, almost casually, Richard leaned back and said something that caught me completely off guard. "You know, Margaret, I've always admired how you handle everything with such grace, even when no one is watching." I felt warmth spreading through me, a mix of pride, relief, and a spark of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It was a human connection, unexpected and real, existing without demands or urgency. For the next hour, we talked more freely than I had in months. Work details gradually gave way to stories from our lives, reflections, small confessions. Laughter came naturally, and with it, a sense of comfort and trust I hadn't realized I'd been craving. By the time I left the room, I felt different. The ordinary day had shifted into something extraordinary. Moments like this, rare, unplanned, and profoundly human, remind you that connection doesn't follow rules. Sometimes it simply arrives, quietly and completely. After that afternoon in the conference room, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard's words. It wasn't the kind of thing you easily dismiss, especially at my age, after years of routine and familiarity. There was something in the way he spoke, careful, respectful, yet undeniably personal, that lingered in my mind long after I returned to my desk. The next day, the office felt different. The fluorescent light seemed a little warmer, the hum of the copier a little softer. Even the casual greetings from coworkers carried a faint shadow of expectation, as if I was waiting for something to unfold. Richard, however, acted as if nothing had changed. He greeted me with his usual calm smile, but there was a subtle intensity in his eyes, like he was silently checking if I remembered the conversation we'd had. By mid-afternoon, we found ourselves alone again, this time by the coffee machine near the empty break room. It was a small, inconsequential space, yet suddenly it felt charged with unspoken words. He handed me my cup, our fingers brushing briefly, a fleeting spark that made me catch my breath. "You seemed different yesterday," he said softly, not as a tease, but as an observation. I guess I just realized something," I admitted, my voice quieter than usual. that maybe there's more to these moments than I've allowed myself to notice. He nodded, a thoughtful expression softening his features. It's easy to forget that even small connections can matter, especially when we're used to being surrounded by people yet feeling alone in some ways. The honesty in his tone was disarming. There was no rush, no agenda, just the simple, steady presence of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. We talked about work briefly, but the conversation drifted naturally to our lives outside the office, books we were reading, small regrets, dreams that felt long postponed. I found myself sharing things I rarely mentioned, the quiet evenings I spent painting, the journals I kept tucked away, the sense of longing for moments that felt truly mine. Richard listened, not with polite nods or distracted glances, but with full attention, like he was learning the rhythm of my life, piece by piece. And somehow that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The office clock ticked on, yet we remained there, suspended in that delicate bubble of conversation. I noticed the way sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the floor, and for a moment it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. There was an unexpected tenderness in the air, a mutual respect mingled with the quiet thrill of something unspoken yet understood. As the day ended, we parted with a smile that carried meaning far beyond words. I walked to my car feeling a strange mixture of excitement and reflection, a gentle warmth that spread through me and stayed long after I had left the building. It wasn't about romance, not yet, but about discovery, about recognizing that connection can appear in the most ordinary places, and that mutual respect, attentiveness, and shared understanding can create a bond deeper than either of us had anticipated. I realized that day that sometimes life offers subtle surprises, ones that make you question what you thought you knew about yourself and others. And sometimes those surprises arrive quietly, leaving a lasting impression long after the moment has passed. The days that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation I hadn't expected. Every interaction with Richard became charged with a subtle intensity, a sense that there was something unspoken hovering just beneath the surface. I caught myself noticing little things, the way his hand lingered slightly longer on the stapler when he passed it to me, the small tilt of his head when he listened, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke. It was during one of those late afternoons, when most of the office had cleared out, that the moment came again. The conference room was empty except for us, the city skyline outside glowing golden as the sun began to set. Shadows stretched across the polished table, and the hum of the building felt softer, almost intimate. Richard turned toward me and said, "Margaret, do you ever feel like life gives us these moments to remind us of who we really are?" I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. Yes, more often than I'd like to admit. And sometimes they arrive in the most unexpected places. He nodded, leaning slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table. I think that's what's happening now. I've realized how much I value our conversations. More than just professionally, I've come to appreciate the way you think, the way you see things. I felt a warmth in my chest, a rush of emotion I hadn't anticipated. His words weren't grand or theatrical. They were quiet, precise, and somehow even more powerful because of it. I realized in that moment that the bond between us was deepening in ways I hadn't allowed myself to recognize before. "I feel the same," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I think I've been craving this connection for a long time. I just didn't know it could exist like this. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, the unspoken acknowledgement hanging between us. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared understanding, fragile yet real. The tension in the room was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it in the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, in the way our proximity seemed to matter more than words. Then he said something that surprised me again. "I don't want to cross any lines, Margaret, but I also can't ignore what we're sharing feels like." His honesty was disarming. I realized that I had been holding back, fearing that acknowledging my own feelings might ruin the careful balance we built. But hearing him speak so openly gave me permission to admit the truth to myself. "I don't want to ignore it either," I said softly. There was a pause, the kind that stretches out and becomes almost tangible, before we both laughed quietly at the tension, a laugh that carried relief and recognition. It was a release of months, maybe years, of silent longing and unacknowledged curiosity. We spent the next hour talking about our hopes, our regrets, the quiet parts of our lives that we rarely shared. Each word, each glance, each subtle gesture seemed amplified in that golden light. I realized that what was happening between us wasn't just about attraction. It was about understanding, about mutual respect, and about discovering a part of ourselves we had set aside. When the evening came to an end, we left the conference room with a sense of calm intimacy. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful had shifted between us. And as I drove home that night, the city lights passing by, I felt an unexpected serenity, like a chapter of my life had quietly, beautifully begun anew. The following week, life returned to its familiar rhythm, but something had undeniably changed. Even in the midst of meetings, deadlines, and the usual office chatter, there was a quiet thread connecting Richard and me, an invisible current of understanding, respect, and shared experience. It wasn't about drama or urgency. It was about the simple knowledge that someone saw you, truly saw you, and that you saw them in return. One afternoon, I found myself walking down the corridor toward the conference room, my heart lighter than it had been in years. Richard was already there, reviewing some documents, the late sunlight streaming through the window and casting a warm glow across his face. It struck me how ordinary and extraordinary he looked at the same time, the way he could be completely professional and yet entirely human in a glance. We greeted each other softly, a wordless acknowledgement of everything we had shared. Sitting down, I noticed again the small details I had learned to appreciate, the way he tilted his head when listening, the quiet attentiveness that made you feel important without needing to say it. It was comforting, grounding, and deeply human all at once. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning back in his chair, "about how rare it is to find someone who understands you in ways you didn't expect. I'm grateful for this, for us." His words made my chest ache with warmth. I realized then that this connection wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something enduring, built on respect, shared vulnerability, and emotional honesty. "I feel the same," I said, smiling. "It's rare to find that kind of understanding, especially after so many years of thinking you've already figured out your place in the world. And yet, here we are, learning new things about each other, about ourselves." There was a pause, but it wasn't awkward. It was reflective, a gentle acknowledgement that life often surprises you in ways you least expect. We didn't need to define it or label it. The significance was already there, quietly powerful, rooted in experience and trust. In the weeks that followed, our conversations continued, sometimes about work, sometimes about life, sometimes simply about the fleeting moments that make everything else worthwhile. I began to notice how much more alive I felt, how much lighter the days seemed, and how much richer the connections around me had become simply because I had allowed myself to recognize one meaningful connection fully. Looking back, I realized that day in the conference room was a turning point, not just in my relationship with Richard, but in my understanding of myself. It reminded me that life doesn't stop offering opportunities for connection, intimacy, and emotional growth, even when you think the chapters of your life are already written. Some moments, it seems, are quietly transformative. They don't announce themselves with fanfare, but they linger in your heart, reshaping the way you see the world and the people in it. And as I sit here today, reflecting on everything, I feel a profound gratitude for the unexpected, for the unspoken, and for the deep, enduring understanding that sometimes arrives when you least expect it. Life has a way of surprising you, even in the most ordinary places, and for that, I will always be grateful.